Hola amigos, this is Level 12, and today we are back with our 6th installment of WW1 Hetalia edition. Today's episode is called Breaking the Deadlock. We will be discussing different aspects of the home front, life in the trenches, and on Verdun and the Somme, the important battles. This episode is going to be a little different compared to others because over half this chapter was about the home front, which I think is much less important compared to the battles of Verdun and the Somme, but whatever. So, one of the biggest problems facing the Western Front on both sides was having adequate munitions. And munitions are things like ammos, guns, artillery, things like that. And if you don't have enough munitions, you couldn't push the war forward. You were just kind of stuck in the trenches, and no one wants that. We discussed this last episode where Russia couldn't get supplies to the front, both because it wasn't very industrialized, but also because it didn't have good transport system. Yeah, similar problems face nations like Britain, France, and Germany. See, even though they had factories and stuff, it was hard to get them to turn over to wartime production. A lot of factories didn't want to do it, at least to the amount needed to sustain the army. Different countries had different methods of getting places to convert to wartime production, and some of them I think the government just bought outright. I don't know, I was too lazy to go through each country's policy. Yet, even with the newly converted factories, there was still the issue with how much could be produced. There are only 24 hours in the day, and only so much one person can work during those hours. This led to shells and ammo being made cheaply and quickly. While this technically got more stuff to the front, they would often cause guns to explode or break because the ammo wasn't, the proper size it need be. In the Battle of the Somme, Britain had a 30% dud rate for its bombs. That is like atrocious quality control. And how did they get people to work in these factories, you may be asking? Well, most able-bodied men were at the front. Men that fell out of the conscription range for fighting fell into the conscription range for munitions work. With more machines and processes being automated, more unskilled workers could participate on the factory floor. This also gave way to women working. Now, something to point out. Women worked in factories before this in varying degrees from country to country. While, yes, the percentage of women working did go up during these times, it wasn't this big dramatic thing I think history textbooks try to portray. Also, I know all of these images feature women. It was a big propaganda thing. The final issue before getting to life in the trenches was delivering all these supplies and communicating with the home front. Granted, Britain, France, and Germany were way better off than Russia in this department. It didn't come without its challenges. Communication was especially hard because of the distance and the danger. Common methods were horses, mules, carrier pigeons, and a hand deliverer. All these methods had their drawbacks, especially the human carrier, because by the time he got to and fro, the information he carried could be useless or out of date. Finally, we're going to talk about life in the trenches. They sucked. That's the short and sweet of it. But honestly, there is an argument to be made that trenches saved lives because if they were just on flat ground 24/7, the casualties would be enormous because the trenches did provide protection. Also, the average soldier spent only about 100 days consecutively in a trench before being sent somewhere else or home for leave. It wasn't just for 4 years straight a man was in a trench. The biggest dangers of trench life were pretty much trench rot, which we've already discussed, and lice. Not just head lice either, but full body lice that caused terrible itching. They would get into clothes and uniforms, and it was a mess. But life in the trenches wasn't always terrible. See, there was this policy known as live and let live, which basically was, I don't shoot you, you don't shoot me. This allowed for downtime where soldiers would play cards, chess, music, and even read in the grassy areas near the trenches. Now, this kind of unspoken policy varied from trench to trench, but overall, it worked for the places that silently agreed to its terms. However, like with the Christmas truce, headquarters did not like hearing this policy, so to break up the monotony, they would force soldiers to do raids. Raids meant going over the top of the trench and charging into no man's land. This would lead to many casualties, typically on the offensive side. Whether ground was captured or not really wasn't the point. The point was to have the casualties and to have the soldiers see that the enemy will kill you. That, in turn, helped break up the policy of live and let live. But enough of that boring stuff. On to Verdun. So Verdun lasted from February 21st, 1916 to December 18th, 1916. In short, it was an offensive maneuver planned by Falkenhayn to try and end the war. See, Falkenhayn believed in a war of attrition, which basically means to wear down the enemy until they collapse. But he took it to the extreme where he wanted to bleed the French dry. His entire goal was not to capture land, but to kill as many French soldiers as possible, which is very hard to tell your own soldiers that you're not trying to capture fort or land or supplies, you're just there to kill. It's very hard to tell someone. Now, an offensive like this would obviously take a lot of manpower, and again, the offensive side likely loses more than the defensive, yet Falkenhayn rationalized it by stating for every 2 German soldiers killed, 5 French soldiers would be killed. Interesting ratio, but go off, I guess. Obviously, an offense like this needed lots of planning and maneuvering. Luckily for the Germans, when they were doing a lot of this planning, the weather was dreary and cloudy, so the French, even with airplanes, couldn't see what the Germans were planning. This massive assault was meant to come from quite literally nowhere, and it did. The significance of attacking Verdun as well was that it had been a massive battle site during the Franco-Prussian War. This war was the war to settle old scores, I swear. Now, Verdun, while it had a lot of surrounding forts near it and little underground garrisons, Verdun was considered a very cushy position. It was considered weak, and second-tier soldiers would be stationed there. The reason it was like this was because of the wall that surrounded it. It was considered impregnable, which, if the siege of Liège is anything to go by, that's a flat-out lie. On February 21st, 1916, the Germans bombarded Verdun and just pushed forward with incredible force. They fired artillery from 25 miles back and hit target after target. One such target was meant to be a bridge. However, it was misaligned and it hit a church. But that was a big no-no. Citizens were desperate to escape the literal hell that became Verdun, and the French quickly realized they needed to do something before the army completely fell. On the other hand, the Germans were celebrating. Later, they eventually were able to capture another fort thought to be this huge threat because of its guns and how many men it could hold. But this fort, called Douaumont, was nothing like the Germans had planned. All the heavy guns that had been removed, and instead of 500 soldiers, it housed 58 at the time of seizure. It went down very quickly. These victories got back to Germany and were met with resounding results. Both regular citizens and soldiers thought this was a means to an end. If they could just push harder into Verdun, then France would collapse. These victories were used as both a good way to boost morale and perpetuate propaganda in the Germans' corner. The French really needed to shut this Verdun operation down and realized they were invested in this for the long haul. To oversee the French response to Verdun was a man named Philippe Pétain. Pétain realized a few things when he took control. First, Germany had only attacked from one side of the Meuse River, which meant the German left side was open for attack. Now, prior to the attack on Verdun, Britain and France had planned on making an offensive attack on Germany sometime in late 1916. The attack on Verdun just kind of propelled that idea. The only issue was that the French were pretty committed at Verdun. This venture would be heavy Britain-oriented, which Britain agreed to. This would become known as the Battle of the Somme. I'll put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it. We just have other things to talk about. The second thing Pétain realized was that in order to fight back the Germans, they needed supplies and men replacing those lost at the front. This was where the term Sacred Way or Voie Sacrée, I don't know, came from. This was a strip of road that had supplies coming to and fro round the clock. Convoy after convoy would pass through this road and really help to beef up the French defensive. Pétain actually was stationed in a building that overlooked this convoy so he could see it whenever he looked out his window. It made him feel proud. On to the Battle of the Somme. Keep in mind that the Battle of Verdun was still going on at this time, and the Battle of the Somme acted more of a release pressure valve on the French. The Battle of the Somme took place between July 1st, 1916 and November 18th, 1916. However, the British actually opened fire on June 24th. On the first day, casualties totaled into the tens of thousands. It was insane. Part of this is because the British didn't really know what they were doing, whereas the French did. It was a mess, and it was really just to relieve pressure on Verdun, which it was actually able to do. Because Germany was fighting the Russians to the east, then the Somme, maintaining Verdun was hard. This is also where mustard and nerve gas was introduced into the war, but the French soldiers were prepared for it. And through these new attacks and constant pushes from the Germans, the French held on somehow. By July 12th, the Germans abandoned Verdun, and Falkenhayn was dismissed from his position in August. Slowly yet surely, the French gained back all territory lost since February, and the Verdun campaign closed on December 18th. The Somme continued in a less fruitful venture. As I keep saying, it was like a release valve. However, it did introduce tanks into the war. On September 15th, the British introduced tanks for the first time. They looked big and scary, but let me tell you, they were pretty much useless. They often got stuck and the treads would fall off. But if you were a German soldier and you saw it coming your way, you would be scared because you had no idea what it was. The Battle of the Somme closed on November 18th, 1916. The battle really doesn't have a clear winner because of the high casualty rates on both sides. One can argue the Entente technically won because they won at Verdun, but that's up to interpretation. I want to end on some interesting effects because of Verdun, one of them being the psychological impact the battle had on the French and the German. They said never again would they do something with that much carnage. Also, during World War II, where French and German lines were approaching each other, they specifically avoided Verdun because of the war prior. Finally, remember how I said 30% of artillery were duds? Well, even over 100 years later, they're still finding shells in the ground in places at and around Verdun. Imagine you're just like digging in your yard one day and you hear a tank sound only to discover it's an unexploded World War I bomb. Amazing. Super interesting. So I'm sorry this episode was again kind of short. Also, I didn't use that much Hetalia characters. I felt this one you needed to kind of see what was going on more than just what I can do with my slides. I think next episode, America finally enters the war. I'm not entirely sure. It's a mess. But thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more random fandom things. Ciao, chicos.